Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com and today I'm here with a card featuring honeybee stamps. This week, Honeybee is having a challenge to turn Instagram green and use green as your primary color in making a card with honeybee stamps and then to share it on Instagram with the tag BEEgreen, B-E-E green though. And I thought that was a really fun challenge. I had recently just picked up my very first honeybee stamps and I have admired their stamps for a long time, and there's more sets that I'd certainly like, but I try to keep to somewhat of a budget and not purchase everything I like. So I'm sure I'll purchase more in the future, but I had gotten this mermaid and I thought I could definitely make her work, even though when you think of mermaids or the ocean you might think of more blues, but you can certainly find a lot of greens there too. And so I decided to start with some iced spruce distress stain, and I covered a piece of watercolor paper with that. Then I was trying to create the look of an ocean, but with some greens and blue greens, because I figured, the ocean does have that appearance at times. Obviously, there's parts of the world where the ocean looks super clear blue sometimes, but there's other parts of the ocean where it's not so much. But I was using this ocean stencil from Create a Smile, and I found that ultimately it looked more like seaweed to me, and so that's what I kind of went with. And I think you could probably create a pretty similar look without even using the stencil and simply pulling your distress stains down over in sort of like a wavy pattern, and so you could create a very similar background without the stencil, although it does kind of give you a little bit of a guideline, which could be nice if that's what you prefer. And so I had a couple of colors of distress stain that I was using besides, originally I used the ice spruce to cover the background. Then I pulled in the MOWED lawn. I felt like that was very, very bright green, but that's what gave me the idea for the seaweed. So ultimately I'm happy that I decided to try to do that. And then I was trying to layer evergreen bough over it, but it's just either it's too similar to the background color or the MOWED lawn is too strong. I think if I were making the background again, I might start with evergreen bough as the background instead of the ice spruce. But since I wanted the look of seaweed and I wanted to make a more distinction of there being ocean in the background, I did use a touch of salty ocean and pull in some blue. Of course, the challenge is to use green, but I don't think the expectation is there'd be nothing but green, just that green's your main overall color. So I had colored a mermaid off screen because I'd never colored this stamp before, and a lot of times the first time I color a stamp, I take a long time and I second guess things and maybe I don't make the right color choices. So I usually color one as practice, but I wanted to share the coloring with you today. Please let me know in the comments if you like seeing more of the coloring. I don't always include it. I don't know that I always will, but it's helpful to know what you guys prefer to see in videos. So I started with my E77, and I'm not doing anything super fancy with the highlighting, but I did make her hair appear darkest where it's closest to her face. And the logic behind this and the logic behind the general way that I'm going to color this mermaid is that the light source, if you're in the ocean, should be coming from the top of the ocean. And so there should be some highlights on the top of her hair or on the top of her fin or the top of her skin. So that's a general rule, but I also did think it was important to make her appear dimensional and give her a little bit of a rounded effect. I just, in retrospect, probably would have even added more of a shadow to the left side than the right side, since the right side would be closer to the sun. So I'd still want to add a bit of a shadow there, just not as big of a shadow as on the left side, which would be even more in shadow because of the direction of the sunlight. So I blended out the E77, which was my darkest color, with 74 and then down to 71. And I kept the blending very simple. What I like about this particular image and some of the other images from Honeybee is that there's so much detail to the hair created by the artist who drew the stamp that you don't really need to add a lot of detail with your coloring. I think it would still look really pretty and have a feeling of motion even if you colored it all one solid color. That's not what I personally prefer to do, but I think that that could work. So coloring her face, I am using E25, 23, and 57. 25 is the darkest. The 57 is actually the medium tone in this instance. And then the 23 is my lightest color that I'm blending it all out with. I'm starting with darkest again. I put the shadows on both sides of her face because it will make her face appear rounded. But again, as I mentioned before, I think a little bit bigger or darker of a shadow on the left side would have maybe made a bit more sense. You also might want to add a little bit of shadow where her hair meets her face, since that would likely also cast a shadow. I don't always tend to go really detailed into the shadows just because that's not what's fun about coloring for me personally. I think some people really enjoy that. That's what they like about it. They like that sort of art aspect of it. And I enjoy adding some dimension, but not overthinking the shadows personally. I am going to color the rest of her skin with the same techniques, but I wanted to limit how much coloring was in the video since I'll just kind of, again, just use the same things. As I mentioned in other videos, I like to color a variety of skin tones. I prefer not to just color everyone Caucasian, even though obviously I am. And so, if I were making a card specifically for someone, maybe I would choose to use their skin color. But because I create cards to donate, I like to just use a variety of skin tones so that way the cards could hopefully be matched up to the children who are receiving them, or at least that different people are represented in the cards. And that's probably kind of silly and you don't need to hear it every time, but that's my personal philosophy. And so I've been experimenting with different colors, and this was one combination, the 23, 57, and 25, that I thought worked for a darker skin tone. And then I totally skipped telling you about how I color the tail. It was YG 11, 14, and 17, or maybe no, 13. 11, 13, and 17 there. Again, I put the shadow on the bottom just because it should look like the light source is coming from the sun. And then I didn't show the rest of the coloring because it's a lot of the same old. I also colored the turtle. I used the same YGs, the 11, 13, and 17, but I also pulled in a G07, a G94, and 99. The 94 and 99 are the darker areas. The stamp set had this swimming by, to say, and then a bunch of sentiments you can choose. One of the reasons I picked this stamp set is because it had the pretty mermaid like some of the other ones, but it had some general or some sentiments that work for general things. So swimming by, to say, I think there's like thanks, miss you, hi, and one other thing. But I thought I could also, if I have the swimming by, to say, I could add in some personalized stuff, or I could try to pair it up with the other sentiment stamp set that I purchased. And so I stamped all of those elements separately because they are separate stamps, and I am heat embossing here because I want it to stand out. This is kind of a busy background, and if I stamped in just black without putting the clear embossing over it, it would be less noticeable. In retrospect, because I was kind of thinking, like, what would I do to improve my cards? I might choose to, instead of just stamping directly onto the background, put a banner. But honestly, I think that you could still read it pretty well, and it would have detracted from the background to put a banner. So I don't know. I probably would keep it the way that I originally did it. But if you felt like it wasn't very readable, that would be my suggestion, adding a banner instead. So I did have a bit of trouble. This distress stain was placed on top of watercolor cardstock, and I did use my embossing buddy, which is just like a powder that you use so that the embossing powder hopefully doesn't stick where it's not supposed to. However, I found that it was sticking where I didn't want it, and I'm not entirely sure why. I'm assuming it's partly because this would have taken a long time to dry, being pretty saturated with different layers of distress stain, but you could always test it beforehand by sprinkling some embossing powder, making sure it's coming off, and then, doing your actual stamping. It turned out not to be too big of a deal. I used a brush to wipe away some of the extra, and I was able to make my sentiment pretty easily. I did use a stamping tool there just to make sure everything was lined up straight. And another thing that might be a little bit tricky to see, but I think you can now see it better, is that I used a Wonky Wavy stitch rectangle from Kat Scrappiness to cut out this seaweed background, and I did that just for a little bit of interest so that there would be a nice bold white border, and I thought that the wavy lines of the die kind of matched up with the seaweed background that I created. And here I'm just going to add a few sequins from Honeybee Stamps. I think Honeybee Stamps makes a lot of beautiful sequins and accessories, so I really enjoy that. I'm attaching them with Zots, and at first I used just these large clear sequins from the mix that my sister gave me because I didn't actually get a chance to purchase any Honeybee, but you know, I'd been gifted some, and I liked the clear ones, but I thought that I needed a little bit more, so I'm going to put a second smaller clear one next to each of the larger ones, and I hope that that kind of looks a bit like air bubbles. And that's it for my card today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in more crafting tutorials, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I will leave a link to my Instagram and to Honeybee Stamps Instagram because, like I mentioned, this is an Instagram challenge, and to all the products that I used. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate all the views and comments and the time you take to share with me. Thank you so much.